Hello, we are going to do the development of face today. The learning objective for today's session are: number one, describe the role of frontonasal prominence, maxillary prominence, and mandibular prominence in the development of face. Secondly, describe the formation of oblique facial clefts. And thirdly, describe the features of congenital microstomia. Okay. The development of face begins in the between in the fourth week and ends at the eighth week. And at the end of the eighth week, embryo has unquestionable human appearance. Before we start the development of face, we should know what are the pharyngeal arches. These pharyngeal arches start to develop in fourth week of the development, and they develop as a result of migration of neural crest cells from the developing mesencephalon and the rhombencephalon. These arches form a series of bars in the region of the foregut, and these arches contain mesenchyme, and they are lined externally by ectoderm and internally by the endoderm. And the pharyngeal arches contribute to the development of face, jaw, ear, and neck. And the most of the skeletal component in the head and neck is derived from pharyngeal arches. And the neural crest cells migrate into these pharyngeal arches to form the mesenchyme. The original mesoderm of the arch gave rise to muscles of the face and neck. So here you see there are the pharyngeal arches developing in the region of the pharynx. This is first and second pharyngeal arch, and these pharyngeal arches are separated externally by clefts called as pharyngeal clefts. And each pharyngeal arch has got its own muscular component, its own nervous component, and skeletal component. Here again, you see these are the pharyngeal arches, and these are lined externally by ectoderm and internally by endoderm. Okay. Uh, during the development of the face, there is development of the five facial prominences, and there is one frontonasal prominence on the ventral aspect of the forebrain, and paired maxillary and paired mandibular prominences. So there are two maxillary and two mandibular prominence and one frontonasal prominence. These maxillary and mandibular prominence, they are derived from the first pair of pharyngeal arches, and these prominences develop around stomodium, which is the future mouth. So the frontonasal prominence is at the rostral boundary of the stomodium, mandibular prominence is at the caudal boundary, and laterally there is maxillary prominence. Again, you see this is the stomodium. Above it there is a whole frontonasal prominence. On lateral sides there is maxillary, and below its mandibular prominence. So first of all, frontonasal prominence. The upper part of the frontonasal prominence will give rise to forehead, and in the lower part there is development of thickening of the ectoderm called as nasal placoids. They develop at the end of fourth week. Here you see these are the nasal placoids, which are the primordia of the nose. And with further development, what happens? There is proliferation of the mesenchyme around these nasal placoid, converting these placoids into pits. Here's the nasal pit surrounded by proliferation of the mesenchyme, which on the medial aspect is called as medial nasal prominence, and on the lateral aspect it's called as lateral nasal prominence. So there's nasal pit, there's medial nasal prominence, and there's lateral nasal prominence, all developing on the frontonasal prominence. And this lateral nasal prominence is separated from the maxillary prominence by this nasolacrimal groove. So there is development of the nasolacrimal duct in this groove, Nasolacrimal duct, initially is the thickening of the ectoderm, but later on this is canalized to form a duct, and its upper part is expanded to form the lacrimal sac. So the nasolacrimal duct extends from the medial angle of the eye to the nose. So they are nasal pits, which are the primordia of the anterior nares, surrounded by these medial and lateral nasal prominences. The medial nasal prominence, these two, they will join together to form the central part, which is called the philtrum of the upper lip. It also forms the crest and tip of the nose. And the lateral nasal prominence, here it forms the alley of the nose. So this was about the frontonasal prominence. Now coming to the maxillary prominence. Maxillary prominence itself is forming a cheek, and along with medial nasal prominences, it's forming the upper lip. So the lateral part of the upper lip is derived from the maxillary prominence. These maxillary prominence grow and medially, and they compress the medial nasal prominences towards the midline. So subsequently, the cleft between the medial nasal prominence and the maxillary prominence is lost, and the two mesenchyme of the two fuse. Here you see, these are the medial nasal prominences moving towards midline because of the growth of this maxillary prominence, and the central part, that is philtrum of the upper lip, it is derived from the medial nasal prominences. Um, uh, these two together join to form intermaxillary segment, and then it's forming the philtrum of the upper lip. And the lateral part of the upper lip is derived from the uh, maxillary prominence. So the upper lip is formed by the two medial nasal prominences and two maxillary prominences. Fine. Yes, you see this is the upper lip. In the center it is derived from frontonasal, and the lateral side is derived from the maxillary prominence. But later on what happens is there is overgrowth of the mesenchyme from the maxillary prominence over the frontonasal prominence. So at the end whole upper lip is derived from the maxillary prominence. You see the median is a prominences moving medially, and they enlarge and merge with each other to form a segment called as intermaxillary segment. This segment is between the maxilla on each side. So this is intermaxillary segment. It's formed by the fusion of the medial nasal prominence. And I've told you its derivative, that is philtrum of the upper lip and bridge and tip of the nose. Here again, this yellow colored is that is forming the philtrum. It's from the intermaxillary segment, and this red colored part is from the maxillary prominence. Hmm. Intermaxillary segment is formed by, I have told you, because of fusion of medial nasal prominences, and the derivatives are philtrum of the upper lip. It also forms the premaxillary part of the maxilla that bears the four incisor teeth and its associated gums. It also forms a part of the palate that is triangular, lies anteriorly, that is called as primary palate. This lies just behind the four incisor teeth. And this primary palate then will join with the secondary palate, which is derived from maxilla, and the point of fusion is marked by incisive foramen in adults. Secondary palate is derived from the palatine shells developing from the maxilla. They develop in 66th week of the development. So the maxillary prominences derivatives are cheek, which merge laterally with mandibular prominence, and it's also formed the part of the upper lip except central part. and it also forms the palate except premaxilla. The anterior and medial part of the palate is derived from intermaxillary segment, but the rest of the definitive palate or secondary palate is derived from maxilla. Lower lip and jaw, they both are derived from just mandibular prominences. Here you see this is is derived from the mandibular prominence, and it merges with the maxillary prominence later. This is maxillary prominence, mainly forming the cheek area, but the lower part of the cheek is derived from the mandibular prominence. In case there is failure of fusion of maxillary prominence with the lateral nasal prominence, it will lead to formation of the oblique facial cleft, and the nasolacrimal duct is open in this case. There can be some conditions of cleft lip and cleft palate. Cleft lip is there can be median cleft lip. It is formed by malfusion of the medial nasal prominences. There can be cleft on one side, that is called as unilateral cleft lip. It results from failure of the maxillary prominence to merge with medial nasal prominence on one side, on facial side. And this cleft lip can be bilateral. It results due to failure of the maxillary prominence to meet and unite with the medial nasal prominence on both sides. There can be a smaller opening of the mouth, that is called as microstomia, or can be large, that is called as macrostomia. Microstomia develops due to excessive fusion of the maxillary prominence with mandibular prominence, and if there's less fusion, it can lead to macrostomia. Thank you.